Hey everyone, today we're stepping into the 1960s American kitchen, where the household day often began with the click of a stove knob, the bubbling of a metal coffee percolator, and a lunchbox opening on a Formica counter before the rest of the family was fully awake. These were not rules printed in a cookbook. They were habits learned by watching, repeating, and occasionally discovering what happened when breakfast was late. The first rule was simple. The kitchen had to wake before everyone else. By the time bedroom doors opened, the room was expected to be warm, organized, and already producing coffee, toast, eggs, oatmeal, or whatever the household budget and schedule allowed. If you enjoy remembering the foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules, and family traditions that once filled American homes, please like the video and subscribe to Forgotten American Home. Which morning sound from a 1960s kitchen do you remember most clearly? And what did your family always serve before school or work? The rules in this list were not followed in exactly the same way by every household. They varied by region, income, family size, culture, and work schedule. What made them unwritten rules was the quiet expectation behind them. Someone usually knew what needed to happen when it needed to happen, and how much trouble would arrive if it did not. In many homes, morning kitchen work began before sunrise or shortly after it. A woman might enter in slippers and a house dress, turn on the small light above the sink, and listen to the refrigerator motor begin its steady hum. Coffee came first in households that depended on it, measured into a percolator that would soon begin making its familiar hollow bubbling sound. Bread went beneath the toaster coils. A skillet waited for bacon, sausage, or eggs when the grocery budget allowed, while oatmeal, toast, cereal, or leftover biscuits handled the ordinary weekdays. The kitchen was often cool at first, especially in winter, and the stove brought more than breakfast. It brought warmth, movement, and the first proof that the home had started operating. By the time anyone else wandered in, the room could appear almost effortless. That appearance was part of the trick. Breakfast had not magically assembled itself. Someone had already checked the bread, found the clean cups, noticed that the milk was running low, and decided whether 4 eggs could be persuaded to look like enough. The morning rule extended beyond the breakfast plate. School lunches had to be built, while supper leftovers, sandwich fillings, fruit cookies, and thermos bottles were still available. Wax paper might be folded around a peanut butter sandwich, a bologna sandwich, or whatever the family considered dependable enough to survive until noon. A piece of fruit rolled into the lunchbox. A small treat might appear when groceries had been generous that week. Metal lunchboxes needed their clasps closed, and thermos lids needed to be tightened with a seriousness usually reserved for machinery. One loose cap could turn a child's arithmetic book into a soup course. Meanwhile, breakfast dishes began collecting beside the sink. Cereal boxes opened and closed, and children were reminded that the refrigerator door was not meant to stand open while they considered every possible future. The kitchen's morning worker was therefore cooking, packing, counting, cleaning, and directing traffic at the same time. Convenience products had begun promising easier mornings, but even instant cereal required bowls, spoons, milk cleanup, and someone who knew where everything was. The exact routine depended heavily on the household. In farm homes, early shifts could begin long before the school bus arrived. In cities, factory schedules, office commutes, bus routes, and apartment kitchens created different rhythms. Some women remained home during the day, while many others also prepared themselves for paid work after feeding everyone else. Single mothers, grandmothers, older daughters, fathers working alternate shifts, and other relatives could share or carry the morning work. The polished advertising image of a cheerful housewife serving a perfectly timed breakfast represented an expectation more than a universal reality. Real kitchens included burned toast, missing homework, a child who suddenly remembered a school project, and the discovery that someone had returned the empty milk carton to the refrigerator, as though this were a valid storage decision. The rule was not that every breakfast had to be elaborate. The rule was that the morning needed a manager. Even a simple breakfast of toast and coffee required timing when several people had to leave through the same door within 20 minutes. There was also an emotional discipline built into the early kitchen. The person doing the work often tried to keep the room calm because a hurried household could unravel quickly. A missing lunchbox led to shouting. A scorched pan delayed the eggs. A child refusing breakfast created negotiations no cookbook had prepared for. Yet these ordinary tensions rarely appeared in photographs of spotless countertops and smiling families. What remained in memory was often the sound a spoon tapping a cup, a knife scraping toast, a cabinet door closing, the radio playing softly while someone checked the clock. Children might not have understood the planning behind those sounds, but they understood that breakfast appeared and that the day moved forward. Years later, the smell of percolated coffee or warm toast could bring back not only the room, but the person who stood inside it already working, while everyone else was still deciding whether to get out of bed. That was the first unwritten kitchen rule of the 1960s home. The kitchen started the household, and the person responsible for it was expected to stay one step ahead of hunger clocks, school bells, and empty containers. The meal might have been plain. The labour behind it was not. Once breakfast had been served and the lunch boxes had left the counter, the room changed from morning station to daytime workshop. Before the next egg cracked, or the next pan warmed, however, another small signal usually appeared. An apron came off its hook tied at the waist and announced that the real kitchen work had begun. The apron usually waited on a hook behind the pantry door, folded over a chair or hanging from a nail near the stove. Before flour was measured, potatoes were peeled, or bacon grease began snapping in a skillet, it was pulled over a house dress and tied firmly at the waist. In many 1960s kitchens, that small piece of cotton marked the beginning of serious work. It protected clothing from dishwater tomato sauce shortening coffee and the pale dust that rose when flour was scooped from a canister. Washing an apron was easier than washing and ironing an entire dress, especially when laundry already filled much of the week. The rule was practical: protect the clothes beneath, because another clean outfit could not be wasted on one spilled pot. But the apron also acted like a uniform. Once the strings were tied, the woman wearing it became the cook cleaner organizer, and person everyone called when a jar would not open. Aprons came in many forms. Some were plain waist aprons made from leftover fabric or flour sack cloth. Others covered the chest and tied behind the neck, offering more protection from splattering grease and dishwater. A carefully sewn apron might have contrasting trim, a gathered skirt or a pocket large enough to hold a clothespin, a grocery note, a handkerchief, or the teaspoon someone had been searching for all morning. Pattern companies and women's magazines offered designs that could make an ordinary household tool appear decorative, cheerful, and almost too attractive for actual contact with gravy. Gift aprons sometimes arrived at bridal showers or Christmas gatherings stitched with flowers, ruffles, or humorous sayings. Yet the apron used every day was rarely preserved in perfect condition. Its fabric softened, the ties twisted, and one corner might carry a faint stain that no amount of soaking completely removed. It became useful precisely because it no longer had to remain precious. The apron's pockets performed quiet work of their own. A woman could tuck in a towel, carry eggs from one counter to another, hold a recipe card away from wet hands, or gather crumbs before shaking them into the trash. The lower edge sometimes became an improvised pot holder, although that was more habit than ideal safety practice. It could wipe a child's face, dry damp fingers, polish a spot from a glass, or protect a hand while lifting a warm serving dish. In a busy kitchen, the apron was expected to do several jobs before lunch. It was clothing towel, carrying cloth and emergency equipment, all while pretending to be nothing more than a decorative rectangle. Children remembered grabbing its edge to get attention. Family members remembered seeing it move between stove-sink, refrigerator and table. The pattern might fade from memory, but the motion remained: tie, wipe, lift, carry, untie. Not every woman wore an apron every day, and not every household treated it as essential. A woman rushing home from paid work might cook in her office clothes with only a towel tucked at the waist. Another might change into slacks or an older dress that could survive stains without protection. Regional traditions, income, family customs, and the type of cooking all affected what was worn. A breakfast of cereal and toast demanded less armour than frying chicken, canning vegetables, baking pies, or preparing a large Sunday meal. Still, mid-century advertising often presented the apron as part of the ideal homemaker's appearance. The woman in the picture was dressed for labour, but somehow remained untouched by it. Her apron was crisp, her hair was arranged, and no onion had ever made her eyes water. Real kitchens were less cooperative. Steam-curled hair, dishwater-darkened fabric, and a spoon dropped into sauce usually landed in the one place the apron had failed to cover. There was also a social rule hidden in when the apron came off. During ordinary family work, it belonged in the kitchen. When a visitor appeared, especially an unexpected one, some women quickly untied a stained work apron before answering the door. A cleaner or more decorative apron might remain, but the heavily used one revealed too much of the day's labour. It carried grease spots, damp patches, flour marks, and evidence that the household did not maintain itself through good intentions alone. In homes where hospitality mattered, company was meant to see the finished room, the arranged table, and the food ready to serve. The mess that produced those results was supposed to disappear. Removing the apron could therefore be a small transformation from worker to hostess. The same woman remained, but the visible signs of scraping pans and washing lettuce were folded out of sight. For some children, the apron became inseparable from the person who wore it. A certain floral print meant pancakes. A heavy white apron meant holiday baking. A faded pocket might hold a piece of candy, a safety pin, or a grocery receipt. Aprons absorbed kitchen smells. Coffee onions, yeast-fried meat, furniture polish, drifting in from the next room. They became part of the visual rhythm of home moving past the refrigerator and bending toward the oven, always present without being discussed. Years later, finding one in a drawer could bring back the room more clearly than an expensive serving dish. The apron was ordinary enough to be ignored and personal enough to be remembered. That was the second unwritten kitchen rule: protect the clothes, prepare for the work, and keep the evidence of that work under control. The apron did not make cooking effortless, and it certainly did not keep every stain away. It simply announced that the kitchen had entered its working hours. Once it was tied, breakfast could become lunch, lunch could become supper, and every task had to move according to the family clock. Soon, another expectation took over, one that involved more than clothing or spilled flour. Dinner had to be ready when the household expected it, whether the roast cooperated or not. The clock on the kitchen wall was not merely decorative. By late afternoon, it had become the most demanding object in the room. Potatoes needed time to soften meat, needed time to brown, gravy needed attention, and a casserole could not be persuaded to cook faster simply because the bus was already turning onto the street. In many 1960s households, dinner was expected to be ready near the moment the family returned from work, school errands, or evening activities. The meal did not have to be elegant, but it had to arrive on schedule. A saucepan rattled beneath its lid, the oven door opened briefly, and someone checked the window, listened for a car, or calculated how many minutes remained before everyone began asking the same question. The unwritten rule was clear. Dinner should meet the household at the door looking calm even when the kitchen behind it was not. That expectation often shaped the entire afternoon. A roast stew or pot of beans had to begin early enough to become tender. Frozen vegetables waited until later because they cooked quickly, while potatoes were peeled, onions chopped, and canned goods opened according to their own small timetable. A woman who stayed home might arrange the work around laundry children appointments and shopping. A woman returning from paid employment faced a different race, sometimes beginning supper the moment she put down her handbag. Older children might be told to set the table, peel vegetables, or watch a younger sibling while the stove took priority. In households with factory shifts, farm chores, long commutes, or irregular hours, the schedule could be more complicated still. The familiar image of a husband arriving at exactly 5:30 to find dinner waiting represented an ideal more than a national reality. Actual families came home late early, tired, hungry, and occasionally with an extra person who had not appeared on the meal plan. The cook therefore learned to manage not only food but uncertainty. Some dishes tolerated delay. A stew could remain warm at the back of the stove, and a casserole might survive under foil for a while. Other foods punished poor timing immediately. Fried meat lost its crispness. Mashed potatoes formed a dry skin. Green vegetables softened from bright to tired while waiting for someone delayed by traffic or overtime. Gravy thickened until it could nearly stand upright. The challenge was to make several different foods reach the table hot at the same moment, a skill old advertisements rarely acknowledged. Those pictures showed a smiling woman lifting one perfect roast from the oven. They did not show her counting burners searching for the missing serving spoon and deciding whether the rolls could warm beside the casserole without becoming small brown stones. Dinner timing was less like following one recipe than directing several minor emergencies toward the same deadline. Convenience foods promised relief from that deadline. Canned vegetables could be heated in minutes. Condensed soup helped form sauces. Boxed mixes reduced measuring. Frozen dinners, instant potatoes, and prepared ingredients offered new ways to shorten the path between cupboard and plate. Yet convenience rarely removed every step. Someone still had to plan the meal, buy the package open it, combine the ingredients, watch the stove, set the table, and clean the dishes afterward. A box might save 20 minutes and then request a skillet, a saucepan, milk, butter, and 3 separate utensils as payment. Families adopted these products because time mattered, especially in homes where women balanced paid work with domestic responsibility. But even a quick supper still carried an expectation of coordination. The meal was supposed to feel like dinner, not merely several packages that had happened to become warm at the same time. Children learned the schedule from the kitchen smells. Fried onions meant supper was still some distance away. Toasted cheese or hot dogs suggested the evening might move quickly. A roast scent filling the hallway meant someone had started hours earlier. The sound of plates being taken from the cabinet was a final warning that playtime was ending. In some homes, children were expected to wash their hands and appear promptly. In others, one person called from the kitchen several times while the food cooled, and patients did the same. The cook often stood between hunger and household discipline. Served too early and someone important might not be home. Served too late and children complained tempers shortened, and the evening schedule began to collapse. Homework, baths, television programs, church meetings, and bedtime all waited behind dinner. The meal was not simply one event. It was the hinge on which the rest of the evening turned. There was emotional pressure hidden inside that timing. A meal served on schedule could make the household appear orderly even when money was tight, work had been exhausting, or the day had gone badly. The table offered a brief suggestion that everything was under control. This expectation could be comforting, but it could also be heavy. The person responsible for supper was expected to anticipate appetites, delays, preferences, and portions without allowing the effort to dominate the room. In some families, appreciation was spoken. In others, a clean plate was the nearest thing to a compliment. Dinner might have taken hours to plan and 40 minutes to prepare, only to disappear in 12. The timing was remembered more clearly when it failed the burned roast, the late arrival. The meal kept warm too long, or the evening when everyone ate sandwiches because the stove refused to cooperate. The third unwritten kitchen rule was therefore not simply to cook dinner, it was to make time itself behave. Supper had to be ready when the family needed it, warm enough to feel welcoming and organized enough to hold the evening together. No household followed the same clock, and many families adapted the rule to shifts, commutes, school events, or whatever the day demanded. Still, the kitchen often carried responsibility for turning scattered schedules into one shared meal. Long before the plates reached the table, that work began with another quiet ritual, the grocery list, where the week's dinners were first imagined in pencil before a single package entered the cart. The grocery list often began before anyone reached the supermarket. It started at the kitchen table on the corner of a newspaper, the back of an envelope, or a small pad kept near the telephone. Before milk, bread and coffee were added, someone first had to answer a larger question: what would the family eat for supper all week? In many 1960s households, the list was built around several planned meals, rather than a collection of unrelated packages. Sunday's roast might become Monday's sandwiches and Tuesday's hash. A chicken could appear first as the main dish, then return in soup or beneath a crust. Ground beef might be divided between meatloaf, spaghetti sauce and a casserole. The unwritten rule was that groceries should arrive with assignments already waiting for them. A package without a plan could sit forgotten behind the mustard until it became too old, too expensive, or too mysterious to defend. Planning began with what was already in the house. Pantry doors opened, refrigerator shelves were inspected, and the freezer compartment surrendered whatever could be identified beneath the frost. A half box of noodles suggested one supper. 3 potatoes and an onion suggested another. A can of tomatoes could begin chili sauce soup or something ambitious involving rice. The person making the list had to remember what was running low and what had been purchased twice because nobody checked the cupboard first. Flour, sugar, shortening coffee, canned milk, bread, eggs, and breakfast cereal formed the dependable background. Then came the ingredients needed to turn those staples into actual meals. This was household inventory performed without a computer, a barcode, or any sympathy from the child who'd finished the last of the peanut butter and returned the empty jar to the shelf. The week's schedule shaped the menu as much as appetite did. A busy evening with church school activities, club meetings, or a late work shift called for something that could be prepared quickly or kept warm without complaint. A quieter evening might allow a roast bean stew or a dish that needed longer cooking. Friday meals could reflect religious customs in some homes, while Sunday dinner often received more time, attention and money than an ordinary weekday supper. Families with large gardens, home freezers nearby farms, or relatives who preserved food planned differently from apartment households, relying on smaller refrigerators and frequent shopping. Some women mapped out 7 complete dinners. Others carried only a rough sequence in mind: chicken early in the week, leftovers after that, something inexpensive before payday, and sandwiches waiting quietly in reserve. The method varied, but the practical aim remained familiar. No one wanted to discover at 5 o'clock that the household possessed 6 cans of peaches and nothing that could reasonably be called dinner. The newspaper often joined the planning process. Supermarket advertisements announced weekly specials and a lower price on meat, canned goods. Coffee or produce could rearrange the menu before the list was finished. Coupons were clipped, folded, and placed in an envelope or handbag where some remained until long after they expired. Trading stamps, store promotions, and familiar brands could influence where a family shopped, but the budget usually had the final vote. A planned pot roast might become chuck steak, hamburger, or chicken if the price was wrong. Fresh vegetables could be replaced with canned or frozen ones, and a dessert could disappear entirely when the total began climbing. The list therefore acted less like a command and more like a negotiation between appetite advertising household loyalty and the amount of cash available. It promised order, but the supermarket aisle was always ready to test that promise with bright cereal boxes, displays of cookies and children who suddenly developed strong opinions about breakfast. There was a special skill in writing the list in the order the store was arranged. Produce might come first, followed by meat, canned goods, dairy products, bread and frozen foods near the end, so they spent less time warming in the cart. Not every shopper organized the page this way, but those who did saved themselves from crossing the same tiled aisle 3 times. The list could also protect against impulse buying, although it was not always powerful enough to resist a sale sign or a package promising that dinner had become modern. Children sent to retrieve one item might return with another, and a husband asked to stop for milk could come home with milk snacks and no explanation for the missing bread. Still, the handwritten list represented the household's best attempt to make the trip efficient. It carried meal plans, brand preferences, quantities, substitutions, and reminders such as only if cheap, written with enough firmness to sound like a warning from the kitchen itself. The list also recorded invisible decisions about who would eat what and how far each ingredient needed to stretch. A growing child required more lunch food. A visiting relative meant another serving at Sunday dinner. A spouse working late might need a plate that reheated well. Someone had to remember the school bake sale, the neighbour coming for coffee, or the fact that 3 eggs were already promised to tomorrow's cake. These calculations were rarely praised because they looked like pencil marks rather than labour. Yet a well-planned list could prevent waste, reduce extra trips, and carry a family from one shopping day to the next. When the paper returned home folded inside a grocery bag, its work was not finished. The purchases still had to be stored, rotated, and protected from being used too quickly. Behind the pantry door waited the next unwritten rule. The shelves were never supposed to become completely empty. The pantry door opened onto a small wall of reassurance. A sack of flour rested below the shelf, sugar waited in a canister, and rows of canned vegetables, soup, fruit, milk, and tomato products stood behind jars of rice, beans, noodles, and coffee. In many 1960s kitchens, the shelves were not supposed to become completely bare. The household might run low, especially near payday, but a careful cook tried to preserve enough ingredients for at least one more breakfast, one more supper, and one unexpected complication. The rule was not about displaying abundance. It was about avoiding the helpless moment when a child was hungry, the weather turned bad, the car would not start, or a guest appeared, and the cupboards had nothing useful to offer. A stocked pantry acted as a quiet buffer between the family and whatever the week had failed to predict. It did not need to look impressive. It only needed to contain enough ordinary ingredients to make the next meal possible. What counted as a pantry staple depended on the household. Flour, sugar, salt, shortening coffee, tea, canned milk, and baking powder were common in many homes, but regional and cultural traditions shaped everything around them. A southern cupboard might rely heavily on cornmeal, beans, rice, canned tomatoes, and ingredients for biscuits or cornbread. Other families kept pasta-dried noodles, crackers, canned fish, peanut butter, preserved soup, or specific spices connected to recipes carried through generations. Rural households with gardens, cellars, home-canned food, or large freezers planned differently from apartment families with narrow cabinets and small refrigerator compartments. Some kitchens stored weeks of food. Others had room for only a few cans and one spare box of cereal. The principle remained the same even when the ingredients changed. Do not use the final package without adding it to the grocery list. The open jar belonged to today. The reserve package belonged to the household's future, and opening it without warning could produce a look more powerful than any written kitchen regulation. The reserve was especially important because shopping was not always convenient. Many families made one major grocery trip each week, perhaps with smaller stops for bread, milk, or fresh produce. A household with one car had to plan around whoever used it for work. Rural families might live far from a full supermarket, while city shoppers sometimes carried groceries home by bus or on foot. Weather could interrupt a planned trip, and illness could keep a parent inside for several days. The pantry absorbed these disruptions. Canned beans could become supper. Evaporated milk could rescue a recipe when fresh milk was gone. A box of noodles and a can of tomatoes could be persuaded into something filling. Flour shortening and baking ingredients could produce biscuits, dumplings, pancakes, or a simple dessert when the store was temporarily out of reach. These foods were not glamorous, but glamour was not their assignment. Their job was to remain patiently on the shelf until the household needed an answer. A full pantry also protected the family budget. Buying a few extra cans during a sale could lower the cost of later meals, provided the household could afford the larger purchase in the first place. Coffee, sugar, flour, canned vegetables, and other frequently used goods were sometimes bought when prices were favorable, then stored until needed. Yet pantry abundance was uneven. A family living from one paycheck to the next might keep only a narrow reserve, carefully guarding the last can of soup or the final pound of flour. Another household might have shelves packed so tightly that an old jar could disappear for years behind newer purchases. The same rule, therefore, carried different meanings. For one family, it was careful organization. For another, it was defense against memories of scarcity. Parents who had lived through the Depression, wartime rationing, migration, crop failure, or periods of unemployment often felt safer when food remained visible on the shelf. The cans and boxes were groceries, but they could also be a form of emotional insurance. Children experienced the stocked pantry differently. To them it could look like a collection of possibilities, divided into items they were allowed to touch, and items that clearly belonged to future meals. Crackers, cookies, cereal, and canned fruit attracted attention. Flour shortening and dried beans generally remained safe from unauthorized enthusiasm. A mother might discover that the emergency package of cookies had become an empty wrapper, carefully returned to its original place as though no investigation would follow. Certain shelves were for school lunches, others held baking ingredients or company food that was not to be opened on an ordinary afternoon. The pantry taught a quiet lesson about household timing. Having food did not mean all of it was available immediately. The peaches might be intended for Sunday dessert. The canned milk might be needed for a pie. The extra coffee was waiting for next week. Every package had a purpose, and using it early could disturb a plan that existed only in the mind of the person managing the kitchen. Keeping the pantry supplied required continual attention. The cook noticed when the sugar canister felt light when only one can of tomatoes remained, or when the coffee scoop reached the bottom sooner than expected. These observations became pencil marks on the grocery list before anyone else knew there was a shortage. The work was nearly invisible because success looked like nothing happening. Breakfast continued, dinner appeared. A missing ingredient was replaced before the family realized it had nearly disappeared. That was the fifth unwritten kitchen rule: the cupboard could become modest, but it should not become useless. A few cans, a little flour, something to stretch a meal, and one unopened reserve could keep the household moving through an inconvenient day. But storing food brought another responsibility. Packages could not simply be pushed wherever space appeared. The older cans had to remain visible, because the next rule was just as practical. New groceries went to the back and yesterday's supplies moved toward the front. A newly opened grocery bag could make the pantry look full, but the first task was not simply finding space. The older cans had to be pulled forward and the new ones placed behind them. In many 1960s kitchens, this quiet rotation happened almost automatically. A can of green beans bought last month should be used before the one purchased that morning. The same applied to soup peaches, tomato sauce, evaporated milk tuna, and whatever else stood in rows beneath the shelf paper. The rule protected the grocery budget from waste and kept forgotten food from disappearing into the darkest corner of the cupboard. It also required more attention than anyone watching from the doorway might realize. Labels faced outward. Similar cans stayed together. Bent or damp paper wrappers were noticed. A can pushed too far behind the flour bin could remain hidden until a future cleaning uncovered it, like a small metal artifact from another administration. Pantry rotation mattered because package dates were not always as familiar or as prominent as modern shoppers expect. A careful homemaker often relied on purchase order memory label condition, or a handwritten mark added at home. Some families used a pencil or grease marker to note a month or shopping date on the top of a can. Others simply knew that the faded label belonged in front and the bright new one belonged behind it. The system did not need to be formal to work. It only needed someone who remembered the shelf's history. That person knew which tomato cans came from the last sale, which box of gelatin had been waiting since Easter, and which jar contained something homemade that should be used before anyone became overly curious about its age. The pantry was not just storage. It was a calendar made of paper labels, cardboard boxes, metal lids, and one person's ability to remember what had entered the house and when. Children rarely respected this arrangement unless they had been taught to notice it. They reached for the brightest box, the easiest can, or whatever sat directly at eye level. A husband sent to retrieve tomato soup might return with chicken noodle, because both labels contained red. An older child helping put away groceries could place everything neatly in front, accidentally burying the food that needed to be used first. The result was not usually disaster, but it disturbed the household's small economy. Older crackers went stale while a new box was opened. 2 jars of the same ingredient remained half-used. A can intended for supper vanished behind a stack of fruit cocktail. The unwritten instruction therefore became part of kitchen training: do not merely put groceries away. Put them away in the correct order. Neatness was useful, but usefulness mattered more. A perfectly arranged shelf that concealed the oldest food was simply wasteware and good manners. The rule also shaped how meals were chosen. The cook did not always begin by asking what everyone wanted. She often began by asking what needed to be used. A can with a torn label moved towards supper. A box nearing the end of its patience became dessert. Several older cans of vegetables could be combined in soup, casserole, or stew before newly purchased ones were touched. This did not mean families constantly ate questionable food. It meant that pantry management influenced the menu long before modern phrases such as inventory control entered ordinary conversation. The kitchen operated by practical signals: the bread was drying, the bananas were spotted, the milk needed using, and those peaches had waited long enough. The person planning the meal translated those signals into dinner. A household could save money not only by buying carefully, but by actually using what it bought, a principle so obvious that it was surprisingly easy to ignore. Sales made rotation even more important. When canned goods were offered at an attractive price, a family with enough cash and storage space might buy several at once. The pantry became deeper but also more complicated. Rows doubled, brands mixed. One can of corn looked much like another after the paper bag was emptied and the children disappeared. If newer purchases remained in front, the older supply could be forgotten indefinitely. Some households arranged cans by type, others by meal, and others according to whatever would fit without collapsing. In smaller kitchens, storage might extend to a basement shelf, utility room, cellar, or cabinet above the refrigerator, where reaching one can require confidence and perhaps a chair. The farther food travelled from the main cooking area, the easier it became to forget. Rotation was therefore not merely tidiness, it was a method of keeping the household's investment visible. There was a small satisfaction in a pantry arranged correctly. Coffee stood with coffee soup with soup fruit with fruit, and the oldest package waited in front for its turn. The shelves suggested that the week was under control, even when other parts of the household were less cooperative. Yet the arrangement also revealed how much mental work belonged to the person managing the kitchen. She had to notice quantities, remember purchases, judge condition, plan meals, and explain to everyone else why the unopened box at the back was not the one they should take first. No applause followed a properly rotated row of canned beans. The reward was simply that nothing spoiled unnoticed, and supper could be assembled without an extra trip to the store. That was the 6th unwritten kitchen rule. The pantry had an order, and time moved from the front of the shelf toward the back. New cans waited their turn. Old ones came forward. The system was plain inexpensive and easy to overlook, but it protected both food and money. Once the groceries were settled, another part of the kitchen demanded similar discipline. The refrigerator offered cold milk, leftovers, fruit, and the irresistible possibility that something more interesting might appear if the door remained open long enough. It never did, and in many homes someone was already calling across the room to close it. The refrigerator door invited curiosity. Behind its heavy handle waited cold milk, leftover meatloaf, a covered bowl of pudding, jars of pickles, and perhaps one slice of pie that already had an owner. But in many 1960s kitchens the door was not supposed to remain open while a child stared into the light and considered the meaning of hunger. The rule was delivered from across the room with remarkable speed: decide what you want, take it out, and close the door. Refrigerators were valuable working appliances, not illuminated cabinets for afternoon entertainment. Cold air escaped, warm kitchen air moved inside, and the machine had to work again to restore the temperature. Whether or not a child understood the mechanics, the household lesson was clear. Standing in front of an open refrigerator was wasteful, unnecessary, and unlikely to cause a better snack to appear. The refrigerator itself often demanded more attention than modern families might expect. Many 1960s homes had a freezer compartment inside the main cabinet, rather than a large separate freezer, and frost could slowly build around its walls, ice trays and packages. Defrosting might require towels on the floor bowls to catch water, and the temporary relocation of everything that needed to remain cold. Shelves were smaller, storage containers were less uniform, and leftovers might be covered with wax paper foil. Glass lids, plates, or whatever fit securely over the bowl. Milk stood in cartons or bottles. Eggs remained in their carton or moved into the moulded tray supplied with the appliance, and tall jars competed with pitchers for space. Opening the door was therefore not only about losing cold, it disturbed a carefully arranged puzzle. One careless search could knock over the mustard, uncover the onions, or send a small container sliding toward the floor with the confidence of something that knew it would be difficult to clean. Children learned that not everything inside was available simply because it could be seen. A bowl covered with a plate might be tomorrow's lunch. Leftover chicken could be promised to a casserole. A carton of milk had to last through breakfast. The pudding might be cooling for supper, and the gelatin mould was certainly not waiting for someone to test whether it had become solid. The refrigerator was a schedule as much as an appliance. Each item belonged to a future meal school lunch recipe, or visitor. A child opening the door after school saw possibilities. The person managing the kitchen saw inventory. That difference explained many firm conversations near the crisper drawer. Taking the last slice of cheese was not merely eating cheese. It could remove an ingredient from sandwiches planned for the next morning. Drinking directly from the orange juice container was unacceptable for several reasons, but disrupting tomorrow's breakfast was usually high on the list. The rule became especially important when several family members used the refrigerator without reporting what they had taken. Someone finished the milk and returned the empty carton. Someone opened a second jar before the first one was gone. A child pushed an uncovered bowl behind a pitcher where it remained until its identity became a family debate. The cook was expected to know what food existed, what condition it was in, and when it needed to be served. That responsibility became much harder when everyone treated the shelves as private territory. The refrigerator door might carry magnets, school notices, shopping lists, recipes, and appointment cards, but inside order mattered even more. Older leftovers belonged near the front. Strong-smelling foods needed covering. Raw ingredients and cooked foods required sensible separation. Produce went into drawers, bottles into door shelves, and anything likely to leak was placed where one accident would not season the entire refrigerator. In smaller homes, the refrigerator also represented limited space. A large Sunday meal could fill every shelf with bowls, pans serving dishes and packages wrapped in foil. Preparing for a holiday or church gathering required careful rearrangement. One dish moved to the porch in cold weather, another waited in a cooler, and the refrigerator became a crowded building where every tenant objected to the others. Separate home freezers were available to some families, but they were not universal, and the freezer compartment above the refrigerator often had to manage ice trays, frozen vegetables, meat, and a box of ice cream at the same time. The door could not remain open during a long search, because the search itself caused more difficulty. Frost-softened packages shifted, and the cold air that had been carefully maintained drifted into the kitchen. The machine hummed longer afterward, sounding almost offended. There was also a sound attached to this rule, the rubber gasket releasing as the door opened, bottles lightly touching the refrigerator motor beginning again, and a parent's voice arriving before the child had made a decision. Close the door became one of those household instructions repeated so often that it seemed built into the appliance. It could carry several meanings at once. Stop wasting electricity. Stop letting the food warm. Stop looking for a snack you've not been given permission to eat. Stop standing in the busiest part of the kitchen while supper is being prepared. The open door blocked movement between counter and table, and its bright interior light attracted anyone passing through the room. The refrigerator was useful because it preserved food quietly. The family was expected to help by allowing it to remain closed. That was the 7th unwritten kitchen rule. The refrigerator had to be opened with a purpose. Take out the milk, return the butter, find the leftovers, and shut the door before the cold escaped, and the cook's patience followed it. The rule protected food space, electricity, and the meal plan hidden behind every covered bowl. But once the door closed, another question remained. What should happen to the roast vegetables or potatoes waiting on those crowded shelves? In a careful kitchen, yesterday's supper was rarely allowed to return unchanged. It needed a new shape, a new sauce, and preferably a new name. A covered plate waited on the refrigerator shelf holding 2 slices of roast, a spoonful of peas, and several potatoes that had already served one respectable dinner. In many 1960s kitchens that food was not called leftovers for long. By the next afternoon it had acquired a new assignment. The roast might be chopped into hash, the potatoes flattened into patties, and the peas folded into soup or casserole. Yesterday's supper could return, but it was expected to make an effort. Simply placing the same plate on the table again risked complaints from children who remembered every carrot. Changing the shape, adding gravy, or giving the dish a more confident name made the meal feel less like repetition and more like planning. The unwritten rule was practical food that had already been paid for, cooked and stored, should not be wasted merely because the family had seen it once before. A Sunday roast offered several possible second lives. Thin slices could become sandwiches for work or school lunches. Smaller pieces might be chopped with onions and potatoes, then browned in a skillet until the edges became crisp. The final scraps could enter vegetable soup, gravy, or a meat pie where pastry made a modest amount of filling look generous. A cooked chicken followed a similar path. The best portions appeared at the first meal. Sandwiches claimed some of the remaining meat, and the smallest pieces were picked from the bones for soup, dumplings, noodles, or casserole. In households where the grocery budget had little room for waste, this sequence was not an optional display of creativity. It was part of buying the meat in the first place. One chicken was more affordable when it could contribute to several meals, although by the final appearance it might have travelled through enough sources to require an introduction. Vegetables also returned in disguise. Mashed potatoes became cakes browned in a little fat. Cooked carrots, peas, corn, or green beans entered soups. Casseroles or creamed mixtures served over toast. Rice could be reheated with milk for breakfast, mixed with meat and tomatoes for supper, or turned into pudding when sugar and eggs were available. Stale bread was not automatically discarded. It became toast bread, crumbs, dressing bread pudding, or the layer beneath a creamed dish. The kitchen looked at yesterday's food less as a finished meal than as a collection of ingredients that had already completed the expensive part of cooking. The potatoes were peeled, the meat was tender, the vegetables were ready. What they lacked was novelty, and novelty could sometimes be supplied with an onion, a skillet, and enough gravy to discourage further questions. The transformation required judgment. Some foods improved after a night in the refrigerator, while others seemed to lose interest in life. Stews and sauces could deepen in flavour. Fried food softened. Mashed potatoes stiffened. Cooked meat dried if it was heated too aggressively. The cook learned which leftovers could be reheated directly and which needed moisture seasoning or a completely different method. A little broth revived meat. A white sauce connected unrelated vegetables. Tomato sauce gave yesterday's ingredients a new nationality, at least according to the menu. Casseroles became especially useful because they allowed small amounts of meat noodles, rice, vegetables, cheese soup or crumbs to gather beneath one brown surface. The dish looked unified even when its contents had first met on separate plates. This was domestic diplomacy conducted in glass bakeware. Not every family handled leftovers in the same way. Some reheated the previous meal without apology. Others planned a formal leftover night near the end of the week, placing several small dishes on the table and allowing everyone to choose. Large families often left very little food behind, while smaller households might face the same roast for several days. Regional food traditions, household income, refrigeration space, and the cook's available time all shaped what happened next. A woman returning from paid work might welcome a ready-made plate that needed only careful warming. Another cook might spend an hour turning scraps into a completely new dish because presentation mattered to her family. Some children loved hash soup and potato cakes without realizing they were eating a meal's second chapter. Others recognized one surviving pea beneath any amount of cheese and treated the discovery as evidence of deception. There was a social rule surrounding the language as well. Leftovers could sound tired, especially when company was present. Chicken casserole, beef hash, vegetable soup, or shepherd's pie sounded intentional. The new name protected the cook from the suggestion that she had merely returned yesterday's plate to service. It also protected the family budget from embarrassment. A meal made from remaining food could still be warm, filling, and carefully prepared. Thrift did not mean carelessness. In many households, using food well was evidence of competence. The cook understood how much the original meal had cost, how long it had taken to prepare, and how many future servings remained hidden in the refrigerator. Throwing useful food away could feel almost personal after that much work. The rule carried emotional weight for adults who had grown up during the Depression, wartime shortages, farm hardship, or periods of unemployment. Food was not discarded casually when memory still contained seasons of having less. Even families experiencing greater post-war prosperity often kept older habits of saving drippings, bread ends, bones, and small portions. Yet the practice was not always romantic. It could mean eating the same ingredient repeatedly because there was no money for another choice. It could mean a tired cook standing at the stove trying to make 3 slices of meat satisfy 5 people. The creativity was real, but so was the pressure behind it. A cheerful casserole name did not erase the arithmetic. It simply helped the meal arrive with dignity. That was the 8th unwritten kitchen rule. Yesterday's supper had to become today's possibility. A careful cook saw sandwiches inside a roast soup inside a chicken bone, and another breakfast inside cold potatoes. The food changed shape because the household could not afford to let useful ingredients disappear. Once the last scraps had been rescued, even the fat left in the pan might receive another assignment. Beside many stoves stood a can jar, or metal strainer holding something modern kitchens often throw away. In that room, however, the grease was not finished yet. The small can beside the stove did not look important. It might have been an old coffee tin, a metal container with a fitted lid, a glass jar, or a purpose-made grease strainer with a removable screen. After bacon, sausage, or another piece of meat had cooked, the warm drippings were sometimes poured into it instead of being thrown away. In many 1960s kitchens, especially in households shaped by southern rural working class or Depression-era habits, that fat still had work to do. The unwritten rule was that anything useful should be given another assignment before it reached the trash. Bacon grease could season beans, help brown potatoes flavour greens, begin gravy, or add richness to cornbread and other familiar dishes. What looked like a leftover from breakfast was really an ingredient waiting for supper. Saving drippings began at the skillet. Once the meat had been lifted onto a plate, the cook looked at what remained hot, fat-browned bits, and the concentrated flavour of the food that had just been prepared. Some of it might stay in the pan for eggs or gravy. The rest could be poured carefully through a small strainer into the waiting container, leaving behind larger crumbs that might burn during later use. The practice varied from home to home. Some families saved only clean bacon fat. Others kept meat drippings separately or used them immediately rather than storing them. The container might sit near the stove in one kitchen and be covered and kept cold in another. These were historical household habits, not one universal method, and standards of storage differed widely. What remained consistent was the belief that cooking fat cost money, carried flavour, and should not be discarded without thought. A spoonful of saved fat could change an inexpensive meal. Dried beans were filling, but a little bacon flavour made them feel connected to a breakfast or Sunday meal that had already passed. Potatoes sliced into a skillet browned more confidently when the pan carried the memory of bacon. Greens, cabbage, corn, onions, and other plain vegetables gained richness from an ingredient that had required no additional grocery purchase. In some households, cornbread batter went into a hot greased skillet, creating crisp edges and a smell that travelled beyond the kitchen doorway. Gravy began with fat flour and careful stirring before milk broth or cooking liquid was added. None of these uses belonged to every American family, and many cooks relied instead on butter-shortening oil, margarine, or culturally specific fats. But where the grease can existed, it represented a simple piece of household arithmetic. Breakfast had produced something valuable, and dinner could use it. The rule was reinforced by older memories. Many adults managing 1960s kitchens had lived through the Depression, wartime rationing, unstable farm income, or family periods, when every grocery purchase required careful thought. Throwing away usable fat could feel irresponsible even when the household was now more comfortable. The habit remained because thrift often survives longer than the emergency that created it. A child growing up in a well-stocked post-war kitchen might see only an unattractive container beside the stove. The adult who placed it there might see saved money, familiar flavor, and proof that one meal could assist another. Convenience foods and modern cooking oils were becoming increasingly visible in supermarkets, but older kitchen habits did not vanish the moment a brighter package appeared. New products entered the cupboard beside old practices, and both could remain for years. Children usually knew that the grease container was not to be disturbed. It lacked the charm of the cookie jar and the mystery of a covered dessert, but it occupied protected territory near the stove. A curious child lifting the lid might find pale, solidified fat with darker layers beneath hardly the treasure the location seemed to promise. The container also carried a smell that belonged unmistakably to cooking rather than snacking. It might be moved aside while the counter was wiped and returned to the same place afterward. Like the flour canister, salt shaker, or coffee pot, it became part of the kitchen landscape. No one introduced it to visitors. No one placed flowers beside it. Yet removing it could make the room look strangely incomplete to someone who had seen it there throughout childhood. There was also a practical rule about keeping different flavors under control. Fat used for frying strongly seasoned foods could affect whatever entered the skillet next. An experienced cook knew whether the drippings were suited for gravy, vegetables, potatoes, or something else, and whether they had remained usable. That knowledge was rarely written down. It came through repetition, smell, appearance, family preference, and instruction passed from one cook to another. Because historical storage practices did not always match modern food safety guidance, the memory should not be mistaken for a recommendation to copy every old method. The important point is what the container meant inside its own time. It was evidence that the kitchen treated ingredients as resources, and that the cook was expected to understand not only how food was prepared, but how every useful portion could be carried forward. Not everyone remembered the grease can fondly. Some disliked the flavor, the appearance, or the heavy meals associated with it. Others stopped saving drippings as vegetable oils became more common. Dietary advice shifted, household tastes changed, and younger cooks preferred ingredients that came cleanly measured from a bottle. Kitchens became less tolerant of open containers near the stove, and refrigeration and food safety expectations changed. In many homes, the old tin disappeared quietly, yet the principle behind it survived. Pan drippings still became gravy. Roast juices still entered sauces. Cooks continued saving what could improve another dish, even when the container and method looked different. The practice faded unevenly, because it had never belonged to one kind of household alone. That was the 9th unwritten kitchen rule: the remains of cooking were not automatically waste. The cook looked into the skillet and decided whether breakfast had left behind part of another meal. A spoonful of drippings could season beans, brown potatoes, or help a modest supper taste more complete. The grease can was not elegant, but elegance was never its purpose. It existed because the household expected useful food to keep working. That same expectation applied to the meat itself. A roast, chicken, or package of ground beef could not simply occupy the center of the table and end its responsibility there. In the next kitchen, calculation: a small amount of meat would have to look generous enough to feed everyone. The roast looked smaller once it left the butcher paper. On the cutting board beneath the bright kitchen light, it had to become enough for every plate at the table. In many 1960s households, meat was treated as the center of supper, but the household budget did not always provide a large portion for each person. The cook's task was therefore not simply to prepare it. She had to make it appear generous. A modest cut of beef might be surrounded with potatoes, carrots, onions, gravy bread, or noodles until the serving platter looked full. Ground beef could be stretched through meatloaf casseroles, stuffed vegetables, or sauce. A few pieces of chicken could disappear beneath dumplings or rice. The unwritten rule was that the meal should satisfy the family without announcing how carefully the meat had been counted. Careful slicing was one of the simplest methods. A roast carved thinly across the grain could produce more visible servings than the same meat cut into thick pieces. The slices overlapped on a platter partly covered with gravy, while vegetables occupied the open spaces around them. A small ham might be cut into neat portions and served beside beans, potatoes, or macaroni. Pork chops could be browned and then cooked with rice, cabbage, or sauce so the rest of the dish carried their flavour. Even a meatloaf depended on the knife. Thick slices made the first plates look impressive but could leave the last person staring at the end piece. Thin, even slices promised fairness, or at least reduced the chance that someone would begin measuring portions with suspicious attention. The cook often served the plates herself because she knew exactly how far the meat needed to travel. Ground beef offered more opportunities for expansion because it could be mixed with ingredients that were less expensive and more filling. Breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, oats, eggs, onions, rice, or grated vegetables appeared in meatloaf and meatballs depending on the family recipe. In a skillet, a pound of hamburger could join tomatoes, noodles, beans, potatoes, or canned soup, and become supper for more people than the meat could have fed alone. The package might advertise convenience, but the kitchen supplied the arithmetic. Hamburger was browned, broken into small pieces, and distributed so that every spoonful of casserole seemed to contain some. Children might search for the largest pieces while the cook quietly made certain that the serving bowl reached the far end of the table before anyone returned for seconds. Gravy performed especially useful work. It added moisture to tougher cuts, carried meat flavour into potatoes or bread, and made a small serving feel more complete. Pan drippings were combined with flour and liquid stirred until smooth and poured across slices that might otherwise have looked lonely. Creamed meat served over toast followed the same principle. Small pieces of beef, chicken, ham, or dried meat could be suspended in sauce and spooned over something filling. The meat supplied identity. The toast biscuits, rice, or potatoes supplied the volume. This was not necessarily an attempt to deceive anyone. Families understood that a meal had to balance cost, appetite, and availability. Still, the dish often received a respectable name rather than an explanation of how little meat had entered the pan. Chicken and gravy over biscuits sounded like supper. 3 pieces of chicken divided among 6 people sounded like a committee problem. Casseroles turned, stretching into presentation. A glass baking dish could combine meat with noodles, rice, vegetables, cheese crumbs, or condensed soup beneath one browned surface. The family saw a full dish instead of a small quantity of protein. Leftover chicken became tetrazzini or a noodle bake. Ham appeared among potatoes or macaroni. Tuna mixed with noodles, peas, and sauce until 1 or 2 cans could occupy the entire table. Regional traditions produced different combinations, and not every home relied on the same packaged ingredients, but the basic method was widely useful. The casserole made portions easier to divide, transported well to church suppers, and stayed warm longer than separate pieces of meat. It also created the possibility that a child who rejected peas would consume several accidentally, because they had become impossible to separate from the sauce. The stretching rule could carry both pride and pressure. A capable cook was often admired for making a little go far, particularly when payday was still several days away, or an unexpected guest appeared. She knew which cuts needed slow cooking, which dishes could absorb another potato, and how much gravy would cover the platter without becoming suspicious. Yet the work behind that skill was easy to overlook. She had to plan portions before cooking began. Watch who received the larger serving, and save enough for a late worker or tomorrow's lunch. In some households, adults quietly took less so children could have more. In others, the cook ate the smallest or least desirable piece after serving everyone else. The full-looking table could hide a very precise distribution of food, affection, and sacrifice. Not every family centered supper on meat, and the amounts served varied widely by region, culture, religion, income, and household preference. Beans, cheese, eggs, fish, vegetables, and grain dishes could provide the main substance of a meal. Friday menus in some homes followed religious customs. Farm families might have access to meat in ways city households did not, while other families reserved larger cuts for Sundays or holidays. The familiar image of a roast on every table was partly an advertising ideal. Real kitchens adapted to whatever was affordable and available. Some families remembered generous portions, others remembered meat as flavor rather than bulk, appearing in beans, greens, soups, and rice, instead of occupying a separate section of the plate. That was the 10th unwritten kitchen rule. The amount of meat did not determine how generous the supper appeared. Skill slicing gravy, starch, vegetables, and presentation could make a modest purchase feed a full table. The meal might have been stretched, but the care behind it was genuine. Once the platter reached the table, few people saw the calculations that had taken place beside the stove. They saw dinner, and as packaged foods filled more supermarket shelves, another rule helped preserve that appearance of a home-prepared meal. The box could assist the cook, but it was rarely invited to sit beside the serving dishes. The cardboard box did useful work in the 1960s kitchen, but it was rarely treated as part of the table setting. A cake mix, instant potatoes, boxed macaroni, seasoned rice stuffing mix, or another convenience product could shorten preparation, reduce measuring, and help a tired cook move supper toward the clock. Yet once the food was ready, it usually left the package behind. Potatoes went into a serving bowl. Vegetables were transferred from the saucepan. Cake appeared on a plate or stand, not beside the printed instructions that had produced it. The unwritten rule was that the package belonged to the work of cooking, while the bowl belonged to the family meal. A box could assist, but it was not expected to receive credit. By the time everyone sat down, dinner was supposed to look as though it had emerged from the kitchen rather than from aisle 7. This rule reflected more than appearance. Mid-century convenience foods were often advertised as tools that helped the homemaker save time without surrendering her identity as the person who made the meal. The package promised speed, consistency, and modern efficiency, but the cook was still encouraged to add something of her own. A cake mix might receive an extra flavoring, a homemade frosting, or a decorative topping. Canned green beans could be seasoned with onions, bacon, drippings, butter, or sauce. Instant potatoes might be beaten with additional milk, margarine, or seasoning until they looked less like flakes that had recently met hot water. Condensed soup became a casserole base rather than arriving at the table in its original form. The product saved steps, but the final dish still needed evidence of judgment. Convenience was welcome, looking careless was not. Serving dishes helped complete the transformation. A bright vegetable placed in a glass bowl looked more generous than it had in the saucepan. A casserole brought to the table in Corningware Pyrex or another familiar baking dish appeared unified and intentional even when several of its ingredients had entered the kitchen in cans or boxes. Bread rolls were placed in a basket beneath a folded napkin. Gelatin moved from its mold onto a plate. Salad was tossed into a bowl large enough to suggest abundance. These small acts separated preparation from presentation. The family did not need to watch the can being opened, the powder being stirred, or the directions being consulted twice, because one line had been hidden beneath a floury thumb. They saw the finished meal, The package had done its duty backstage and the serving bowl took the applause. Company made the rules stronger. When relatives, neighbours, church friends, or a spouse's co-worker came to supper, the kitchen often worked harder to conceal the industrial origins of convenience. Crackers came out of their sleeve, pickles left the jar, store-bought cookies were arranged on a plate. A frozen dessert might be slice-topped or surrounded with fruit so that the freezer carton did not appear at the table. Even a purchased cake could be moved onto a stand and presented as though it had always lived there. This was not necessarily an attempt to mislead guests. It was part of hospitality. The host was expected to offer food in a form that looked chosen and cared for. Packaging was designed for transport, storage, and advertising. Serving dishes were designed to say, "This is for you." Children sometimes exposed the entire arrangement by carrying the box into the dining room to prove which cereal, pudding, or dessert they'd requested. Adults usually returned it to the counter. Packages created clutter, displayed prices, interrupted the look of the table, and reminded everyone that the meal had been assembled through ordinary shopping rather than domestic magic. A child might also read the side panel aloud, compare the picture to the actual food, or announce that the box showed twice as much cheese. Old package illustrations were optimistic in ways the kitchen could not always reproduce. Vegetables looked brighter, casseroles stood taller, and every serving seemed to contain the perfect quantity of the ingredient children were currently searching for. Removing the box prevented unnecessary negotiations between advertising and reality. The cook's personal additions also protected family identity. Two households could purchase the same boxed mix and produce meals that tasted noticeably different. One added onions, another used more pepper, and another replaced water with broth or milk. A family might mix canned tuna into noodles, add leftover ham to packaged potatoes, or turn a plain cake mix into the base for a birthday tradition. Recipe booklets, magazine advertisements, and package panels encouraged this kind of adaptation, offering variations that promised to make one product serve breakfast, supper company, or dessert. The modern package did not erase older habits. It entered a kitchen already shaped by regional flavors, family preferences, budget rules, and inherited techniques. The box provided a starting point. The household decided what the food would become. Convenience could also carry a quiet tension. Many women welcomed anything that reduced preparation after a long day, especially those combining paid employment, childcare, shopping, laundry, and cooking. At the same time, advertising often suggested that using convenience products should leave more time for a woman to create an even more attractive meal, a cleaner kitchen, or a happier family. A product that removed one task could introduce another expectation. A quick mix still needed baking, frosting, decorating, serving, and washing up. Frozen vegetables saved trimming and peeling, but they still required a pan seasoning and a place on the plate. The box promised that dinner had become easy. The cook knew that easy was a relative word usually spoken by someone who would not be cleaning the saucepan. That was the 11th unwritten kitchen rule: packaged food could enter the kitchen, but the package usually stopped at the counter. The cook transferred, seasoned, arranged, and renamed until convenience looked like a complete meal. This did not make the food dishonest. It showed how families absorbed new products without abandoning the rituals of serving and hospitality. The box shortened the journey, but the bowl made the food belong to the household. Before either one could do its work, however, there was another discipline waiting beside the mixing bowl. The recipe had to be read before the first egg was cracked, because discovering a missing ingredient halfway through was one kitchen emergency no serving dish could hide. The recipe card might be stained at one corner, softened along the fold, and written in blue ink by someone whose instructions assumed a great deal of common sense. Mix well could mean several minutes with a wooden spoon. Bake until done offered no temperature at all. Even printed recipes in magazines, cookbooks, and package booklets could become troublesome when read too quickly. In many 1960s kitchens, the safest rule was to read the entire recipe before flour entered the bowl, or the first egg was cracked. The cook needed to know whether butter had to be softened, dough had to chill, a pan required greasing, or an ingredient would be divided and used at 2 different stages. Once wet ingredients met dry ones, the kitchen had crossed a line. Discovering that the recipe required 3 eggs when only 2 remained was no longer planning. It was an emergency involving a neighbour, a substitution, or a dessert that would have to become more imaginative than originally intended. Reading first usually led to gathering everything within reach. Flour came from a canister, sugar from another, and spices were taken from a cabinet where several nearly identical tins waited to reward poor attention. Measuring cups, spoons, mixing bowls, pans, and the hand mixer or wooden spoon were placed on the counter before the work began. Butter or margarine might need time to soften. Frozen ingredients needed thawing. Nuts required chopping, and raisins or dried fruit sometimes needed soaking. The oven had to be preheated, but not so early that it warmed the kitchen unnecessarily, while the cook searched for baking powder. This arrangement was not always called by a formal name. It was simply the difference between orderly preparation and opening drawers with batter-covered fingers. A recipe looked short on paper because it did not include the time spent locating the correct pan, separating nested bowls, or discovering that the teaspoon had vanished into the sugar canister. Ingredient quantities demanded particular attention because recipes came from many sources. A community cookbook might preserve a church member's famous casserole in 6 confident lines. A manufacturer booklet could suggest several uses for one canned or packaged product. Women's magazines offered carefully tested dishes, while family cards recorded recipes that had changed through years of retelling. One relative measured flour level with a knife. Another scooped directly from the bag and considered accuracy a sign of nervousness. The same instruction could produce different results depending on cup size, oven behavior, ingredient brands, and the cook's understanding of what a little meant. Experienced cooks often adjusted by sight and touch, but even they benefited from reading ahead. A recipe calling for 1 cup of sugar at the beginning and another half cup for the topping could become extremely sweet if every quantity entered the bowl at once. The card did not apologize. It assumed the reader had been paying attention. Baking made the rule especially important because some mistakes could not be corrected after mixing began. A stew tolerated an extra carrot. A pot of soup could accept more liquid. Cake batter was less forgiving. Baking soda and baking powder were not interchangeable merely because both came in small containers and seemed interested in rising. Eggs added structure and moisture. Fat affected tenderness. Flour measured carelessly could make a cake heavy, while too much liquid could leave it unwilling to stand on its own. The pan size mattered because batter placed in a dish that was too small could climb over the edge and decorate the oven floor. A pan that was too large produced a thin cake that baked before anyone expected it to. The cook therefore read not only the ingredient list but the equipment instructions, temperature and timing. A birthday cake did not care that the missing pan had been borrowed by a neighbour 3 months earlier. Savoury recipes created their own traps. A casserole might require cooked noodles rather than dry ones, drained vegetables rather than the liquid from the can or chicken that had already been prepared before it entered the baking dish. A recipe promising quick preparation could quietly assume that the rice was cooked, the meat chopped, and the oven hot. Boxed mixes sometimes called for milk, eggs, butter, or meat that the front of the package had not included in its cheerful picture of convenience. Reading the directions from beginning to end revealed the true cost in time and ingredients. It also prevented the cook from using the final cup of milk in one dish when another part of supper still needed it. The household meal was a collection of connected recipes, and each one competed for burners, bowls, oven space, and attention. Planning one dish without considering the others could leave the rolls waiting outside a fully occupied oven. Children helping in the kitchen were often taught the rule through small assignments. One child could read the ingredient list aloud while another found the measuring spoons. Older children learned to grease a pan, sift dry ingredients, or check whether the eggs were still fresh enough for the recipe. These tasks passed along more than cooking knowledge. They taught sequence patience, and the uncomfortable fact that directions near the bottom of the page were just as important as those at the top. A child who poured all the sugar into the batter, before learning that some was reserved for cinnamon topping, remembered the lesson clearly. So did the adult who had to repair it. Family recipes were often taught beside the written instructions, with explanations the card had never recorded which bowl to use, how thick the mixture should look, and why the oven in that particular kitchen ran hotter on one side. Preparation also reduced waste. Ingredients could be returned to the cabinet as soon as they were measured, making it less likely that salt would be added twice, or baking powder forgotten entirely. Eggshells, wrappers, and empty cans could be cleared before the counter became crowded. A missing ingredient discovered early could be replaced sensibly. Applesauce might substitute for something in one family recipe, while another cook changed the entire menu, rather than risk an uncertain result. Substitutions depended on the dish and the cook's experience, and not every household followed the same solutions. The important habit was to discover the problem while choices still existed. Once a cake was half mixed, optimism became the principal remaining ingredient. That was the 12th unwritten kitchen rule. Understand the journey before taking the first step. Read the card, gather the ingredients, prepare the pan, and notice every instruction that might cause trouble later. The rule saved time, protected the grocery budget, and made success look more effortless than it was. When the bowl was finally filled, the cook could move forward with fewer surprises, though the recipe still had one powerful ally capable of ruining the result. After the batter entered the pan and the oven door closed, curiosity had to be controlled. No matter how good the cake smelled, the door was expected to remain shut until the proper moment. The oven door had barely closed before someone wanted to open it again. Through the small glass window when the range had one cake batter seemed to sit motionless beneath the oven, light offering no proof that anything useful was happening. In many 1960s kitchens, however, the instruction was firm: leave the door shut until the cake had time to rise and set. Opening it too early released heat and disturbed the carefully warmed space surrounding the pan. Some delicate cakes were more vulnerable than others, but children were usually given the simpler household version of the science. If you kept looking, the cake might fall. That warning turned the oven handle into a forbidden object, especially before a birthday church supper or Sunday visit when failure would have an audience. Curiosity had to wait. The oven was working, and the best assistance anyone could offer was to stop interfering with it. The rule began before the pan entered the oven. The temperature dial was set, and enough time was allowed for the heat to build. Older ranges did not always behave with perfect accuracy, and experienced cooks learned the personality of the appliance in front of them. One oven ran hot, another browned more strongly near the back. A third required the pan to be turned late in baking, but only after the structure of the cake had become firm enough to tolerate movement. The cook might own an oven thermometer, rely on years of observation, or simply know that the printed time in the recipe was more suggestion than command. She watched the clock, but she also watched for changes in smell, colour, and shape. Baking required patience because the important work occurred behind a closed metal door, where batter slowly became something that could survive being removed from its pan. Children often gathered nearby as the smell began travelling through the kitchen. Chocolate, vanilla, cinnamon, butter, or warm sugar drifted past the table and into the hallway, making the waiting more difficult. A child might crouch in front of the oven window, palms on knees, as though direct supervision could improve the result. Another might ask whether it was ready every 3 minutes. The answer remained no, until enough time had passed for testing to become reasonable. Opening the door simply because the cake smelled finished was discouraged. Smell arrived before structure. The top could appear brown while the centre remained soft, and a cake removed too early might sink into a shallow crater. That depression could later be hidden with frosting fruit or optimism, but the cook preferred not to begin the decorating stage with a repair project. When the proper moment arrived, testing became a small ceremony. The door opened briefly and the cook worked quickly to avoid letting more heat escape than necessary. A clean toothpick, thin skewer or cake tester might be inserted near the centre. If it came out with wet batter, the pan returned to the heat. If only a few crumbs clung to it, the cake was probably ready. Some cooks pressed the top gently to see whether it sprang back. Others watched for the edges to pull slightly away from the pan. These signs depended on the recipe, and experience mattered more than a single universal test. A fruit cake, sponge cake, sheet cake, and layer cake did not all behave the same way. The family rule simplified these differences into one practical command: do not touch the oven until the person who mixed the batter says it is time. The stakes could feel surprisingly high because cake was rarely just cake. It might represent a birthday, a school event, a holiday, a neighbour's visit, or the contribution expected at a church gathering. Ingredients cost money, and starting again was not always possible. Eggs, butter, sugar, flour, cocoa, and frosting supplies had already been measured from the household reserve. A failed cake consumed both groceries and time. Even when a boxed mix reduced some preparation, the result still depended on the correct pan oven temperature, baking time, and cooling method. Advertising might promise dependable success, but the oven retained the right to disagree. The cook therefore guarded the process carefully, keeping children from turning the dial, slamming the door, or opening it to inspect a pan that had only recently begun warming. Once the cake came out, another period of waiting began. It rested in the pan on a rack, cooling enough to handle without breaking. Removing it immediately could tear the soft structure, while leaving certain cakes in the pan too long could make them difficult to release. A knife might be run carefully around the edge. The pan was inverted onto a plate or rack, followed by a quiet pause before it was lifted. If the cake fell cleanly, the kitchen relaxed. If part remained attached to the pan, frosting suddenly received a structural assignment. Children learned that a warm cake was not ready for icing because the frosting would soften, slide, and gather at the bottom in a sweet ring. The cake had survived the oven, but it still had to survive impatience. The rule reflected a larger kitchen discipline. Cooking on the stove allowed constant stirring, tasting, adjusting, and watching. Baking required trust. Once the ingredients had been measured and the pan placed inside, too much attention could become the problem. The cook had to recognize the difference between useful supervision and needless disturbance. That patience was passed down through repeated warnings, failed cakes, and the memory of one oven door opened at exactly the wrong moment. Not every fallen cake was caused by a curious child, and not every recipe was so delicate that one quick look would destroy it. Still, the simplified rule protected more cakes than it harmed. It gave the oven time to perform the work that could not be hurried. That was the 13th unwritten kitchen rule. Once the cake entered the oven, curiosity waited outside. The door stayed closed, the temperature remained steady, and the cook decided when inspection could begin. The rule protected ingredient celebration plans and the fragile hope rising inside the pan. Yet the oven was only one source of danger in the working kitchen. Nearby skillet grease snapped pot handles extended over burners, hot glass dishes crossed the room, and a pressure cooker released steam with enough authority to clear its own space. Children might be welcome at the table, but around the stove they were expected to keep their distance. The stove created an invisible border across the 1960s kitchen floor. Children might pass through the room for a glass of milk, carry plates to the table, or sit nearby finishing homework, but when burners were lit and pans were moving, they were expected to give the cook room. A skillet could spit hot grease without warning. Steam escaped when a lid was lifted. Pot handles extended towards small hands. Electric cords crossed counters, and an oven door opened directly into the path of anyone standing too close. The rule was usually delivered in short commands rather than long explanations. Stay back, do not touch, and move out of the way. The working area around the range belonged to the person cooking. A child who ignored that boundary did not merely interrupt supper. One quick turn, one swinging elbow, or one pan pulled from the wrong direction could turn an ordinary evening into an emergency. The kitchen's danger was made more complicated by its familiarity. Children saw the stove every day, which made it seem less threatening than something obviously forbidden. The burners looked harmless when dark. A pot resting quietly beneath a lid gave no sign of the heat collecting inside it. The handle of a skillet appeared designed to be held, and a chair placed near the counter could transform a toddler into an ambitious assistant. Adults therefore repeated safety rules until they became part of the household language. Pot handles were turned away from the edge when possible. Matches and lighters were kept beyond easy reach. Children were told not to lean against the oven, twist knobs, pull cords, or reach across a pan to retrieve something. The rules varied according to the stove, the child's age, and the family's habits, but the underlying message remained constant. Heat demanded respect even when the appliance looked as ordinary as the refrigerator beside it. Hot grease created one of the clearest boundaries. Bacon, fried chicken, pork chops, potatoes, and other skillet foods could send droplets beyond the pan. The cook learned to approach carefully lower ingredients without unnecessary splashing, and keep a dish or utensil nearby so she did not have to cross the kitchen at the wrong moment. A child running behind her could cause a collision just as she turned with a hot skillet or lifted food from the fat. This was why rough play chasing and sudden entrances were discouraged while supper was underway. The rule was not always explained gently. A sharp voice from the stove could stop a child more quickly than a lesson in kitchen physics. Later, once the danger had passed, the adult might explain why the warning had sounded so severe. In the moment, politeness mattered less than distance. Steam carried a different kind of warning. A saucepan of potatoes, vegetables, or noodles could release a cloud when the lid came off. A kettle announced itself with sound, while other pots remained quiet until opened. Hot glass or ceramic bakeware moved from oven to counter with both hands protected, and everyone nearby was expected to clear a path. The dish might look stable once placed on the table, but children were warned that handles, lids, and serving spoons could remain hot. Even the oven door created a temporary hazard. When it opened, children had to step back and allow the cook to bend, lift, and turn, without someone pressing against her side. The meal might smell inviting, but there was a difference between being called to dinner and gathering round the oven to inspect it. The pressure cooker commanded the most dramatic space. Its heavy lid gauge or regulator escaping steam and unfamiliar noises gave it an authority other pots did not possess. Many families used pressure cookers to prepare beans, tougher cuts of meat, vegetables, or foods that benefited from faster cooking. When used according to the manufacturer's instructions, the appliance offered valuable speed, but it also demanded careful handling. Children were generally expected not to touch it, shake it, move it, or crowd around while it was operating. They might hear a steady hiss or rhythmic sound from across the room and understand that the pot was working under conditions unlike an ordinary saucepan. The adult responsible for it followed the practices taught in the household or described for that particular model. Historical methods and appliances differed, and those remembered routines should not be treated as instructions for using modern equipment. What mattered inside the family was the seriousness surrounding the pot. It had rules of its own, and curiosity did not outrank them. Electric appliances added new cords, hot surfaces and moving parts to the countertop. Toasters, mixers, electric skillets, coffee percolators, and can openers promised efficiency, but they also required the family to learn new boundaries. Fingers stayed away from mixer beaters. Metal utensils did not belong inside a toaster. Cords were not handles, toys or convenient ropes to pull when the desired appliance sat too far away. A child helping with baking might pour ingredients while an adult controlled the mixer. An older child could be trusted with more responsibility, but only after demonstrating that instructions would be followed. Kitchen training happened gradually. First came carrying napkins and setting spoons. Later came peeling, measuring, stirring, and perhaps watching a saucepan. Permission expanded with age and judgment, not merely with the child's confidence that everything looked easy. These boundaries could frustrate children because the kitchen was also one of the most interesting rooms in the house. It contained smells, noises hidden, treats, mechanical objects, and adults performing tasks that produced visible results. A bowl of batter invited tasting. A frying pan invited inspection. A pressure cooker sounded like machinery from a laboratory. Children wanted to participate and many adults wanted them to learn, but teaching had to occur without creating another obstacle in an already crowded room. A stool might be placed at a safe section of the counter. A child could wash vegetables, shape dough, or read a recipe aloud while remaining outside the hottest zone. In this way, the rule was not simply children stay out, it was children help where help is safe. The kitchen could be a classroom, but the stove was still the teacher no one was allowed to argue with. That was the 14th unwritten kitchen rule when heat, steam, grease glass dishes or pressure were in motion. Children gave the cook space. The boundary protected them, but it also allowed the person preparing supper to turn lift drain and serve without another body in the path. The rule softened as children grew older and learned the work for themselves, yet respect for the hot side of the kitchen remained. Once the pans were safely on the stove and everyone had stepped back, another family expectation took shape around the meal being prepared. The cook might adjust a seasoning or leave one disliked vegetable at the edge of a plate, but the kitchen was rarely expected to produce a separate supper for every person who entered it. One pot, one casserole, or one skillet usually represented the evening's answer. In many 1960s households, the kitchen did not operate like a restaurant, where each person selected a private meal from an invisible menu. Supper had been planned around the grocery budget, the available ingredients, the family schedule, and the amount of time the cook could spend standing at the stove. Once the meatloaf entered the oven or the spaghetti sauce began simmering, the decision had largely been made. A child who announced a sudden preference for something else was not presenting useful information. The unwritten rule was that the household ate what the kitchen produced. There might be bread on the table, a glass of milk, or a vegetable that could be avoided with careful negotiation, but a second complete supper was rarely prepared, merely because one person had decided that tonight was not a casserole night. The rule was practical before it was strict. Cooking separate meals required additional ingredients, pans, burners, time, and clean-up. A woman who had already planned the menu shopped for groceries thawed. The meat chopped the vegetables and coordinated the oven could not easily begin again when everyone reached the table. Even a simple alternative created work. A fried egg needed a skillet. A grilled cheese sandwich required butter, bread cheese heat, and another plate to wash. If several children requested different replacements, the kitchen could quickly become a short-order counter staffed by one increasingly unimpressed employee. The family meal depended on limiting those choices. One supper allowed the cook to divide portions, fairly control costs, and move the evening toward dishes, homework, baths, and bedtime. The rule was not always delivered as a lecture. It appeared in shorter forms: "This is what we're having. Take a little. Or you may eat more bread if you're still hungry." Children often tested the boundary through familiar complaints. One disliked onions, another objected to anything touching gravy, and someone else had recently decided that peas were no longer trustworthy. The cook usually knew these preferences before the first complaint arrived. She might leave sauce off one portion, serve a smaller spoonful of the unpopular vegetable or place food separately, when the meal allowed it. These adjustments were different from preparing a second dinner. They represented the small diplomacy required to keep one meal acceptable to several people. A casserole offered fewer opportunities for negotiation, because everything had already entered the same dish and formed an alliance. Children learned to identify the noodles they liked, the meat they tolerated, and the vegetables they hoped could be moved quietly beneath a crust of bread. The cook learned that chopping an ingredient smaller did not make it invisible to a child who had entered the meal with investigative intentions. The one-meal rule could also teach children that family eating involved compromise. A favourite dish belonged to one evening, while another person's preference might appear the next. Not every supper could be designed around the youngest or loudest member of the household. A child might dislike liver cabbage fish beans or a particular casserole, yet those foods could remain part of the family menu, because they were affordable, traditional, available, or enjoyed by everyone else. Parents handled refusal in different ways. Some expected a few bites. Some allowed the disliked item to remain untouched but offered no substitute. Others insisted that the plate be cleaned, a stricter rule that many adults later remembered with less affection. The experiences varied widely, and not every household turned dinner into a contest of endurance. Still, the kitchen generally expected cooperation. Hunger did not grant the authority to redesign a meal after it had been cooked. There were important exceptions, even in homes that strongly followed the rule. Babies and very young children needed different textures and portions. Allergies, illness, digestive problems, and medical diets required real accommodation, although families did not always understand these needs as clearly as later generations would. Religious customs could shape Friday meals, holiday foods, fasting practices, or the separation of certain ingredients. Older relatives might need softer food. A worker arriving late could have a plate covered and saved. Families shaped by different cultural traditions sometimes prepared several connected dishes, rather than one single entree, allowing people to choose among them without creating a separate meal from the beginning. The unwritten rule was therefore not absolute sameness. It was the expectation that ordinary preferences would fit within the meal the household could reasonably produce. Genuine needs were one matter. Deciding at 6 o'clock that only hamburgers would do was another. The rule also protected the cook from an impossible standard. Mid-century advertising often suggested that a capable homemaker understood every appetite, served every dish attractively, and kept the family cheerful while doing it. Real people were less predictable than magazine illustrations. Children changed their minds. Spouses arrived home hungry for something that was not on the menu. A recipe that had been praised the previous month could suddenly be received as though it were unfamiliar evidence in a trial. The cook was expected to absorb these reactions without allowing them to overturn the evening. In some families, appreciation was spoken. and preferences were discussed respectfully. In others, the person who cooked heard complaints before she had taken her own first bite. Refusing to prepare individual replacements was not necessarily a lack of care. It could be a boundary protecting limited time-limited food and the dignity of work that had already been completed. There was also a quiet economic lesson inside the rule. The groceries had been purchased for planned meals, not for unlimited personal selection. The pork chops belonged to Thursday. The cheese was reserved for lunches. The eggs had to last until the next shopping trip. Allowing every person to request a different supper could use ingredients needed later in the week and leave the meal plan with gaps. Children did not always see those connections. They saw bread, eggs, cereal, and peanut butter, and assumed the kitchen contained many choices. The person managing the pantry saw future breakfasts, lunch boxes, recipes, and the days remaining before more groceries arrived. Saying no to a separate meal protected food that already had another assignment. What sounded like stubbornness at the table could therefore be careful planning stretched across the whole week. That was the 15th unwritten kitchen rule. The cook made a family supper, not a collection of individual orders. Small adjustments were possible, genuine needs mattered, and household customs differed, but ordinary dislike did not automatically produce another skillet. The rule saved time, reduced waste, and reminded everyone that sharing a meal required some willingness to accept what had been prepared. Once the dish reached the table, however, the cook had already performed one final test. Before gravy touched the potatoes or soup entered the serving bowl, a wooden spoon usually carried the first taste. The wooden spoon often received the first taste of supper. Before soup entered a serving bowl, before gravy crossed the potatoes, and before a casserole was carried to the table, the cook paused beside the stove and checked what everyone else was about to eat. A little sauce cooled on the edge of a spoon. A bean was pressed gently to test whether it had softened. A small piece of meat was cut from the least visible corner. In many 1960s kitchens, this final taste was not treated as snacking. It was quality control performed by the person whose name would be attached to the meal whether the recipe succeeded or not. The unwritten rule was simple. Never serve a whole family something you had not tested yourself. Salt could still be added. Gravy could still be thinned. Soup could still be rescued from blandness. Once the serving dishes reached the table, however, every flaw became public. Seasoning required judgment because recipes could only go so far. A handwritten card might say salt to taste, which assumed the cook already knew what the dish should taste like. Canned broth, soup, vegetables, cured meat, cheese, and packaged mixes all brought different amounts of salt into the pan. Butter, margarine drippings, onions, pepper, herbs, vinegar, sugar, or tomato could change the balance as the food cooked. A stew that tasted flat at 4 o'clock might become rich after another hour. A sauce that seemed properly seasoned before reducing could become too strong by supper. The cook therefore tasted near the end, then waited before adding more. One extra shake from the salt container could not easily be removed, and the family would notice immediately. The most dangerous kitchen instruction was often just a little more, because little amounts had a habit of arriving together. Texture mattered as much as flavour. Potatoes could look finished while remaining firm at the centre. Beans might need another 20 minutes. Rice could be tender on top and stubborn beneath. A roast could appear brown outside but still resist the knife. The spoon, fork, or tip of a small knife told the truth more reliably than the clock. Experienced cooks learned to judge tenderness through pressure resistance and the way food moved in the pan. They listened to frying, watched the thickness of gravy, and noticed whether a sauce coated the spoon or ran from it like water. These skills were difficult to write down because they depended on touch and repetition. Cook until done sounded unhelpful to a beginner, but to the person who had made the dish for years, it contained an entire education. The first taste also protected the cook from serving food at the wrong temperature. Soup lifted directly from a simmering pot could burn the mouth, so a spoonful was allowed to cool before judgment. A casserole might remain dangerously hot beneath a calm-looking surface. Gravy could thicken as it cooled, while mashed potatoes stiffened if held too long. The cook had to understand not only how the food tasted at the stove, but how it would behave during the walk to the table, the serving of several plates, and the delay caused by one family member who had not yet washed his hands. Timing and tasting worked together. A dish ready too early might lose moisture. A dish finished too late could arrive while everyone watched the kitchen doorway. The spoon offered a final chance to decide whether supper needed another minute or needed to leave the stove immediately. Children watched this ritual closely, especially when the food involved frosting pudding cookie dough or something sweet enough to make quality control appear suspiciously enjoyable. A child might ask for a taste and be told that the cook was checking the recipe, not distributing samples. In savoury cooking, the spoon carried less glamour but more authority. A mother, grandmother, older sister, father, or other household cook tasted considered and made a small adjustment without consulting the table. Sometimes a child helping nearby was invited to judge whether the applesauce needed cinnamon or whether the lemonade was too sour. These moments taught an important lesson. Cooking was not merely obeying instructions. It required attention to the food actually present in the bowl. Two batches made from the same recipe could need different adjustments because ingredients, pans, heat, and human measuring were never perfectly identical. There were sensible boundaries around tasting. The utensil used for raw meat, uncooked eggs, or other uncooked ingredients was not the one meant for sampling. A clean spoon or small saucer could be used especially once the dish was fully cooked. Historical kitchen habits varied, and not every family followed modern food safety practices as carefully as today's cooks would expect. The memory of tasting from the pot should therefore be understood as part of household routine, not as permission to ignore safe handling. The essential purpose was inspection. The cook wanted to know that the food was properly cooked, reasonably seasoned, and ready to serve. What appeared to be one quick spoonful represented the final stage of several hours of planning, shopping, chopping, heating, and waiting. Sometimes the taste revealed a problem that required immediate creativity. Gravy that was too thick received more liquid. Soup that was too thin simmered longer or gained another ingredient. Tomato sauce that tasted sharp might be balanced according to the family's usual method. Burned flavour was more difficult to hide, although cooks developed ways to transfer the unburned portion into another pan without scraping the bottom. A lumpy sauce could be strained, beaten, or served with confidence and dim lighting. Not every dish could be repaired, but the cook was expected to try before admitting defeat. This was where experience became visible. A beginner saw a mistake. An experienced cook saw several possible corrections and one serving bowl large enough to keep the evidence contained. That was the 16th unwritten kitchen rule. The cook tasted first because the family should not discover the problem before she did. The wooden spoon checked salt tenderness, thickness, temperature, and whether the meal could still be improved. It was a small act, but it carried responsibility. Once the spoon was set down, and the dish approved, supper moved toward the table. Meanwhile, the counter behind it had already begun to change. Flour was wiped away, cans were emptied, and mixing bowls disappeared into hot water. In a well-run kitchen, cleanup did not wait politely until cooking was finished. The mixing bowl was rarely allowed to sit until supper was over. Batter sauce, mashed potatoes, and bits of dough became harder to remove with every passing minute. So in many 1960s kitchens, the cleanup began while the meal was still cooking. A bowl that had held meatloaf mixture was rinsed before the residue dried around the rim. The saucepan used for white sauce received hot water as soon as its contents entered the casserole. Measuring cups were returned to the sink, empty cans were cleared from the counter, and flour was wiped away before it could spread beneath every object in the room. The unwritten rule was simple. Wash what you can while you still have the chance. Supper would bring plates, glasses, serving dishes and silverware soon enough. There was no reason to leave every preparation utensil waiting to join them. The rule depended on using small pockets of time. While water came to a boil, the cook rinsed a knife and cutting board. While the casserole baked, she washed the bowl, wiped the counter, and returned ingredients to the pantry. While onions softened in a skillet, she folded the wax paper, threw away peels, and found the lid that belonged to the leftovers. This did not mean abandoning the stove. It meant learning which tasks could be completed safely during the quiet minutes between stirring, turning and checking. A recipe might contain 10 minutes of waiting, but the kitchen rarely considered those minutes empty. They belonged to cleanup. By the time the food reached the table, the room might look almost restored, although the damp dish towel, crowded drain board and spoon balanced over the sink told a more honest story. Hot water was an important ally because dried food could turn a simple bowl into a long argument. Egg flour, gravy, cheese sauce and mashed potatoes clung more firmly once they cooled. A pan used for oatmeal or pudding developed a ring around the inside that seemed determined to become permanent. A quick rinse prevented some of that work even when the dish could not be fully washed immediately. Cast iron, aluminum, glass, bakeware, enamel pans, and newer coated cookware each required different handling, and household habits varied. Some items soaked, others were wiped, rinsed, or cleaned as soon as they were cool enough to touch. The experienced cook knew which pan would forgive delay and which one would punish it. She also knew that soaking was useful only if everyone remembered the pan existed before bedtime. Counter space made the rule especially necessary. Many kitchens did not have a broad, empty surface for every stage of preparation. A small counter might need to hold the flour canister, mixing bowl, cutting board, open package, serving dish, and the grocery list at the same time. As one task ended, its equipment had to move so the next could begin. The bowl used for biscuit dough could not occupy the only useful corner while vegetables were being chopped. The cutting board needed clearing before bread was sliced. The sink itself could become crowded quickly, leaving no room to drain noodles or wash lettuce. Cleaning as the work progressed was therefore not only about making the evening easier, it kept the kitchen functioning. A cluttered counter slowed every movement and increased the chance that a spoon lid or ingredient would disappear beneath something else. Children and other family members could be drawn into the process. One carried empty cans to the trash, another wiped the table or dried a bowl. An older child might wash utensils while the cook finished supper, learning that helping with food did not end when the cookie dough entered the oven. In some households, these assignments were routine. In others, the person doing the cooking also completed nearly all the cleanup. The distribution of work varied, but the expectations surrounding the kitchen often remained severe. The room should not reveal the full extent of the labor taking place inside it. A visitor walking through near dinner time might see a simmering pot and a neatly stacked drain board rather than the collection of bowls, peelings, wrappers and utensils that had existed 20 minutes earlier. Order had to be continuously rebuilt because cooking continuously disturbed it. There was also a practical reason to clear food scraps quickly. Onion skins, meat wrappers, egg shells, flour dust and vegetable trimmings attracted odors and made the counter harder to use. Trash was removed, scraps were collected and spills were wiped before someone placed a clean plate directly on top of them. A damp cloth moved repeatedly between sink and counter, often becoming stained and tired long before the meal was served. Dish towels hung over handles or rested near the drain board, expected to dry hands wipe dishes and somehow remain presentable. The kitchen cloth was one of the room's least celebrated workers. It absorbed spills, protected hands, caught crumbs, and eventually reached the laundry with evidence from every dish prepared that day. Cleaning during preparation did not make the final washing disappear. After supper came the plates, glasses, serving bowls, cutlery pots, and whatever pan had been too hot or too necessary to wash earlier. In homes without dishwashers, the sink became the center of another shift. Even households with a dishwasher still had items that needed scraping, rinsing, soaking, drying, or putting away. But the earlier work mattered. Facing 4 plates and 1 serving bowl was easier than facing those dishes beside every tool used since noon. The clean-as-you-go rule reduced the final burden from overwhelming to merely unavoidable. It also allowed the cook to sit at the table without seeing a tower of crusted mixing bowls waiting behind her. The rule could become a standard by which household skill was judged sometimes unfairly. A tidy counter suggested organization. A crowded sink suggested that someone had lost control, even when the meal itself required complicated preparation, or the cook had been interrupted repeatedly. Real kitchens did not remain spotless while producing food. They filled with steam crumbs, vegetable peels, damp utensils, and containers without lids. The expectation that all of this should disappear immediately added another layer of labor to cooking. Yet many women followed the habit because it genuinely helped. Washing 1 bowl at 4:30 could save 10 minutes of scrubbing at 7 when everyone was tired and the food had hardened into determination. That was the 17th unwritten kitchen rule: never leave a washable task for later, when a quiet minute could handle it now. Rinse the bowl, wipe the spill, return the flour, and clear enough space for the next stage of supper. The kitchen stayed usable because disorder was removed almost as quickly as it appeared. Once the last preparation dish reached the drain board, attention shifted from the working tools to the dishes meant to be seen. Everyday plates might serve the family without ceremony, but when guests were expected, another cupboard opened. Inside waited the serving bowls, table linens, and good dishes reserved for company. The good dishes often lived far from the everyday plates. They waited behind glass cabinet doors on the higher shelf inside a dining room hutch, or in a box lined with tissue paper. In many 1960s homes, these plates, cups, serving bowls and platters were not meant for an ordinary Tuesday supper. They belonged to Sunday dinner holidays, visiting relatives, church guests, anniversaries, or the evening when someone important came through the front door. The unwritten rule was that company deserved a more carefully arranged version of the household. Everyday dishes could carry meatloaf and canned peas without ceremony. The good dishes announced that the meal mattered before anyone tasted it. Their appearance also created extra work because every plate had to be lifted, carefully inspected for dust, washed if necessary, and returned later without a chip that would be remembered for years. What counted as good varied greatly. Some families owned a formal china set received as a wedding gift, perhaps with delicate flowers, a gold edge or cups too small for the amount of coffee most people actually wanted. Others had one attractive platter, several glass serving bowls, or a set of matched dishes purchased slowly through department stores, mail-order catalogues, trading stamp redemption centers, or grocery promotions. A family did not need a complete service for 12 to recognize a difference between everyday and special tableware. The good bowl might simply be the one without scratches. The company glasses might be taller, thinner, and more dangerous in the hands of children. A pressed glass dish divided relish tray cake stand or covered casserole could receive special status because it had belonged to a mother, aunt, or grandmother. Its value came not only from price but from the family occasions already reflected in its surface. Children understood that these dishes followed different rules. They were carried with two hands. They were not used for snacks, backyard meals, or experiments involving jelly and crackers. A child setting the table might be trusted with napkins and silverware while an adult handled the cups. If permission was granted to carry one plate, the distance between cabinet and table suddenly felt much longer. The family could tolerate the loss of an ordinary tumbler with disappointment. Breaking a wedding gift serving bowl might become a story retold at every holiday, until the person responsible was old enough to have careful children of her own. This caution made the dishes seem almost ceremonial. They emerged slowly, one piece at a time, while the kitchen prepared itself for company. Their arrival meant that ordinary supper had become an occasion even when the food beneath the lids was familiar. The table changed with them. A clean cloth might cover the surface, hiding scratches and transforming a kitchen table into something more formal. Cloth napkins appeared in some homes, while others used the best paper ones available. Salt and pepper shakers were filled. Butter moved from its wrapper to a dish. Pickles, olives, celery sticks, or relishes left their jars and entered small bowls designed to make inexpensive extras look intentional. Bread went into a basket beneath a folded napkin. Meat was arranged on a platter rather than served directly from the pan, and vegetables occupied separate bowls, even when doing so created more washing afterward. Presentation was part of hospitality. Guests were not supposed to feel that they had interrupted the household or received whatever happened to be left on the stove. The table said they had been expected even when their arrival had caused an afternoon of rearranging. This expectation placed considerable pressure on the person preparing the meal. The kitchen had to produce food, conceal the preparation mess, protect the special dishes, and create a welcoming table at the same time. A casserole that would normally remain in its baking dish might be garnished before serving. Store-bought rolls received a basket and napkin. A bakery cake moved onto a stand where the cardboard box was no longer invited to explain its origins. The cook watched portions carefully because company required the table to look generous. An extra vegetable, more bread, a salad, or a dessert could make a modest main dish appear complete. Hospitality was partly flavor, partly abundance, and partly confidence. The meal did not need to be expensive, but it should not look uncertain. A guest asking for seconds was a compliment provided enough remained for everyone else. Not every household owned separate dishes, and not every family saved attractive tableware for guests. Some used their best plates daily because possessions were meant to serve people, not wait in cupboards. Others had little storage space or no formal dining room. Large families often relied on durable dishes that could survive constant use, while households with more income could maintain several sets for different occasions. Cultural and religious traditions also shaped when particular serving pieces appeared and what foods they carried. A holiday table in one home might center on a roast and gravy boat, while another displayed rice dishes, breads, fish, beans, noodles, or foods connected to a family's regional and immigrant history. The specific objects changed, but the deeper rule remained familiar when guests arrived. The table should show care. The good dishes could carry emotion that ordinary plates did not. A platter might appear at every Thanksgiving for decades. A pie plate could be associated with one relative's dependable dessert. Cups used only at Christmas slowly became part of the holiday itself. After the older generation was gone, these objects sometimes survived without their original complete sets. One bowl remained after the plates had chipped. 3 cups survived without saucers. A serving dish sat unused because no modern gathering seemed formal enough to justify the risk. What had once been practical hospitality became family memory stored in a cupboard. The dishes waited not only for company, but for the return of a kind of meal that was becoming less common. That was the 18th unwritten kitchen rule. The household's best dishes were reserved for moments when the table had to express welcome respect and occasion. They transformed familiar food into something more deliberate, and reminded guests that their presence had been considered. After the final cup of coffee, however, every fragile piece had to be washed, dried, and returned safely to its shelf. The tablecloth came off the kitchen quieted, and the evening approached its final inspection. Before anyone turned out the light, the stove knobs, refrigerator door leftovers, and appliance cords all had to receive one last careful look. The final inspection began after the last plate had left the table, and the kitchen sounds had softened. In many 1960s homes, no one simply switched off the light and trusted that the room would take care of itself. The stove knobs were checked one by one. The oven dial received another glance. The refrigerator door was pressed firmly against its gasket, and every bowl of leftovers was covered before it returned to the shelf. A saucepan soaking in the sink might wait until morning, but a burner left on milk left outside or a door not fully closed could not. The unwritten rule was that the kitchen had to be made safe before the household went to bed. Cooking had ended, but responsibility continued until the person in charge had looked back over the room and confirmed that nothing hot, cold, electrical or perishable had been forgotten. The stove received the most serious attention. A gas flame could be small enough to miss from across the room, while an electric burner might remain hot long after its glow had faded. The cook turned the knobs to their proper position, sometimes touching each one as she checked it. The oven door was closed, the temperature control returned to off, and pans were moved away from lingering heat. Matches were put back where children could not reach them. A kettle that had boiled earlier was emptied or set safely aside. The kitchen might already look finished, but the stove held the memory of every hot task performed that day. Bacon had snapped in the skillet, soup had simmered, vegetables had boiled, and a casserole had occupied the oven. One careless knob could keep that work dangerously alive. Checking twice was not considered foolish. It was easier than lying awake and wondering whether the front burner had truly been turned off. Electrical appliances created their own closing ritual. The mixer had been cleaned and put away. The electric skillet, toaster, coffee percolator or can opener was checked unplugged in some households, or left in its customary safe position, according to family practice. Appliance habits varied, and not every kitchen owned the same collection of modern equipment. A cord hanging near the sink attracted attention. A toaster filled with crumbs might be dealt with later, but it should not remain where a child could pull it down. The percolator used for the morning coffee was rinsed and prepared to begin again, while the iron or other household appliance carried through the kitchen was returned to its proper place. The promise of the modern kitchen was that electricity would save labour. The final inspection revealed the quieter bargain. Every new cord switch, heating element and plug gave the household one more thing to remember. The refrigerator check involved both the appliance and everything that belonged inside it. Milk returned first because it had little patience for conversation. Butter went back to its dish, or packaged leftovers were covered, and meat intended for another meal was placed where it could remain cold. A bowl forgotten on the counter after supper might not be noticed until the room had gone quiet. The person closing the kitchen learned to look behind the bread basket beneath a napkin, and beside the stove for anything that had escaped cleanup. Refrigerator space was then rearranged to make room for the evening's dishes. A covered plate slid behind the pitcher. A casserole dish claimed most of a shelf. Small bowls were stacked only if their covers allowed it. Finally, the door was shut and pressed once more because a crowded shelf could prevent it from sealing properly. The refrigerator's interior light disappeared, the motor resumed its hum, and the food for tomorrow was left in cold darkness. This final inspection also preserved the week's meal plan. The remaining roast might be tomorrow's sandwiches. A bowl of vegetables could enter soup. Half a pie was expected to survive until Sunday company returned. Leaving one of these foods uncovered, warm, or forgotten did more than risk waste. It disturbed future meals already arranged in the cook's mind. A household running on a careful grocery budget could not casually lose several portions because someone failed to put them away. The cook therefore counted containers almost without appearing to count. The gravy was there, the meat was covered, the milk carton felt lighter than expected, and the last piece of cake had apparently disappeared. During an investigation no child was prepared to discuss. The refrigerator was not simply storing food. It was holding part of the family's schedule, and the nightly check protected that schedule until morning. Doors and drawers received attention as well. The pantry was closed to discourage insects and unauthorized nighttime exploration. Flour and sugar canisters had their lids. The bread wrapper was folded or fastened so the loaf would not dry before breakfast. Towels were hung instead of left in a damp heap, and the dishcloth was rinsed and spread where it might dry. Trash containing meat wrappers or strong-smelling scraps was sometimes carried outside rather than allowed to perfume the room overnight. The kitchen window was closed or adjusted according to weather, and any back door used during the day was checked. These actions were small enough to become invisible, yet together they separated a kitchen that had merely stopped cooking from one that had been properly closed. The inspection carried emotional weight because the kitchen was rarely only the cook's private space. Children passed through for water. A late worker reheated a plate. Someone searching for a midnight snack could open a cabinet, move a covered dish, and leave new evidence behind. The person responsible for the room understood that order might not survive until morning, but she established it anyway. A safe stove, a closed refrigerator, and covered food offered a final sense that the day had been brought under control. In households where women carried most of the domestic labor, this could be an exhausting expectation. The family relaxed after supper, while the kitchen manager continued noticing what everyone else had stopped seeing. No magazine photograph captured that last quiet walk from stove to refrigerator and back again, but many people remembered watching it from the doorway. That was the 19th unwritten kitchen rule. The room was not finished until its heat-cold food and appliances had been checked one final time. The inspection protected the household from danger waste and an unpleasant surprise at breakfast. Once every knob was off and every door was closed, only one task remained between the cook and the darkened kitchen. The sink still reflected the ceiling light, and whatever dishes remained inside, it stood as the final evidence of the day. Before the room could truly rest, those dishes had to disappear. The sink held the final record of the day. Plates leaned against one another beneath cloudy water forks rested at the bottom, and a saucepan waited with a pale ring of sauce drying around its sides. In many 1960s kitchens, these dishes were not supposed to remain there until morning. The room could not be considered closed while supper still occupied the basin. The unwritten rule was that the sink should be emptied, rinsed, and ready before the kitchen light went dark. Food was scraped from plates. Glasses were gathered from the table and serving bowls returned from the dining room. The work might begin while the family continued talking in the next room, but it often ended after everyone else had moved on. Dinner had lasted less than an hour. Restoring the kitchen could take nearly as long. In homes without a dishwasher, the washing followed a practiced order. Glasses and cups often came first while the water was still clean, followed by silverware plates serving bowls, and finally the greasiest pots and pans. Hot water filled the basin, soap produced a layer of suds, and a dishcloth or brush moved steadily from one item to the next. A second sink separate rinse basin or stream of clean water removed the soap before each piece reached the drain board. The arrangement differed from household to household, But the goal remained the same: wash efficiently without turning every dish into another problem. A sharp knife was handled separately. A glass with a small chip was noticed before it broke in the water. Grease was wiped from pans before washing so it did not overwhelm the basin. The cook who had managed several burners at supper now managed an assembly line of wet china, metal utensils and glassware. Dishwashers were present in some 1960s homes, but they were far from universal, and even families that owned one still had work to perform. Plates required scraping delicate items might be washed by hand, and large pans often refused to fit anywhere useful. The machine had to be loaded correctly, supplied with detergent started emptied, and occasionally persuaded that dried casserole belonged to its job description. In many kitchens, the drain board remained busy regardless of technology. A good glass bowl, a wooden spoon, an aluminum pan, or a decorated serving dish might be considered too fragile or too important for the appliance. Labour-saving equipment changed the method, but it did not remove the expectation that the dishes would disappear before morning. The kitchen was still judged by the result: an empty sink, a cleared counter, and no fork waiting beneath cold water to surprise the first person reaching for the faucet. Drying and putting away created another stage. In some homes, dishes remained on the rack until they air-dried. In others, a family member stood beside the sink with a cotton towel drying each plate and returning it to the cupboard. Children could be assigned this task, although the good dishes were often handled by an adult. The work offered a chance for conversation when it was shared. A mother washed while a daughter dried. A husband carried serving bowls from the table. Brothers and sisters argued over who had performed the easier assignment. In other households, one woman completed the entire routine while voices from the television drifted in from the living room. The expectation of a clean kitchen could create family cooperation, but it could also reveal how unevenly household labour was divided. The sink did not care who had cooked, who had worked outside the home, or who claimed to be too tired. It simply waited for someone to finish the day. Once the dishes were gone, the sink itself needed attention. Food particles were removed from the drain or strainer. The basin was rinsed until no grease line remained around the sides. The faucet was wiped, the counter cleared and the dishcloth rinsed before being hung where it could dry. A wet towel left in a heap would sour by morning, carrying an odour that no amount of cheerful breakfast conversation could ignore. The table received another wipe. Crumbs were brushed away. Chairs were pushed into place, and the floor might be swept where bread, cereal, or vegetables had escaped during preparation. The work was not always performed perfectly, and every household had nights when a roasting pan was left soaking with the promise that tomorrow's stronger self would deal with it. Yet the ideal remained powerful. Morning should not begin by confronting yesterday's grease. The empty sink had practical value, but it also carried emotional meaning. A clean kitchen gave the household a fresh starting point. Coffee could be made without moving dirty cups. Breakfast bowls did not have to compete with supper plates. The person entering before sunrise could turn on the light and find the room waiting rather than accusing. For women who had grown up watching mothers and grandmothers' close kitchens this way, the routine could feel almost automatic. It might represent pride, discipline, hospitality, or simple relief. For others, it became an exhausting standard that allowed no acknowledgement of fatigue. A woman could spend the day working, shopping, caring for children, preparing meals and cleaning, yet still feel that leaving one pan overnight meant she had failed to finish. The rule created order, but the cost of that order was often paid by someone whose labour became visible only when it stopped. That tension is part of why these kitchen rules remain so memorable. They were useful habits, but they were also expectations shaped by budgets, advertising family roles, limited appliances, and inherited ideas about how a home should look. The pantry stayed stocked because uncertainty was real. Meat was stretched because money had limits. Leftovers were renamed because waste carried consequences. Packages helped, but presentation still mattered. Children stayed away from hot pans. Recipes were read before mixing, and the stove was checked after everyone else had stopped thinking about it. None of these rules belonged to every American family, and no single 1960s kitchen can represent an entire decade. Urban apartments, rural farmhouses, suburban homes, immigrant households, working mothers, grandmothers, fathers, and older children all created different routines. What connected many of them was the steady work of turning groceries into meals and disorder back into readiness. By the time the last towel was hung, the refrigerator hummed alone, and the counters reflected only a small pool of light. The apron had been removed. The good dishes were back in their cupboard. Tomorrow's bread was wrapped. The coffee pot waited, and the empty sink held nothing except a few drops of water sliding toward the drain. Then the switch clicked, and the kitchen disappeared into darkness. In a few hours, someone would enter again, open a cabinet, begin the coffee, and wake the room before the rest of the household. The rules were never written on the wall because they did not need to be. They lived in repeated movements, familiar warnings, stained recipe cards, and the quiet belief that the kitchen should always be ready to feed the family one more time.